We have been waiting for the GPD WIN 4 with its Vita-like design for some time now. We have it in our hands for a full review, and we will compare the performance with the AYANEO 2, ONEXPLAYER Mini Pro and GPD WIN MAX 2. But first, a quick unboxing. We have the GPD WIN 4 itself, which we will show in more detail shortly. Underneath is a user guide which goes over the functions of the GPD WIN 4. Inside is a charger. We will include the correct adapter for your country. And on the other side is a USB Type-C charge cable. The GPD WIN 4 measures around 8.6 by 3.6 by 1.1 inches and weighs 598 grams. It is the smallest of the 6800U based handhelds by far. Compared to the classic PSP and Vita, you can see the design of the WIN 4 is clearly inspired by them both. The strap hole on the left and shoulder buttons from the PSP, as well as the D-pad and buttons from the Vita especially stand out, but there are other similarities. The display is a 6-inch IPS touchscreen with a native resolution of 1920 by 1080, supporting 40 and 60Hz refresh rates. This is useful if you want to run the game at 40Hz for faster performance or to save battery life. The screen slides up to reveal the backlit keyboard. And like the WIN 3, this has tactile buttons, which feel far nicer to use than the fairly useless haptic keyboard found in its predecessor. On the front, you have all of your standard gaming controls, including Vita-like D-pad. There are some additional buttons, including a fingerprint scanner and an optical sensor, which you can use to move the mouse cursor. On the left is a micro SD card slot and a switch to change between mouse and joystick modes. On the top are the LED lit shoulder and normal trigger buttons. The USB 4 port can be used to connect an external GPU to, for example. Following that is a USB 3 port and a 3.5mm headphone port. On the back are two custom keys that can be defined in the included software. The GPD WIN 4 is powered by the AMD Ryzen 7 6800U processor and the AMD Radeon 680M GPU. There's a choice of 16 or 32 gigs of LPDDR5 RAM and 1 or 2 TB of M.2 PCIe NVMe SSD for storage. For communications, it supports Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. There will also be a separately sold 4G LTE module which connects to the back of the handheld. There is a 45.62 Wh battery, which GPD reports lasts up to 10 hours on the lightest use. In our own tests, we run Cinebench on a loop at 28 watts TDP, and the battery lasted 1 hour 19 minutes. It's roughly around the same amount of time as the AYANEO 2 and ONEXPLAYER Mini Pro handhelds. Whilst running Cinebench, we measured the fan noise and temperature of it whilst under full load. We got a maximum fan noise of 61 decibels and a highest temperature of 41 degrees. Again, it's around the same noise level as the other handhelds and slightly lower temperature. As always, we run some system benchmarks so we can compare the performance with other handhelds. We use 3D Mark, PC Mark, Cinebench and Crystal Disk Mark to cover the CPU, GPU, RAM and storage across different scenarios. We run all of these system benchmarks at 28 watts TDP, so let's take a look at the results. For PC Mark, we got a score of 5054, which was surprisingly lower than what we expected. For 3D Mark, we run 3 benchmarks. On TimeSpy, we got 2788. On Firestrike, we got 6691. And Night Raid, we got 25667. Thankfully, all 3 are very good scores. On Cinebench, we got a score of 11018 on the multi-core benchmark. And for Crystal Disk Mark storage speed benchmarks, we got an highest read speed of 2091 and highest write speed of 1942 megs a second. Overall, they are good scores, but PC Mark was lower than expected, as you can see in our comparison with the AYANEO 2, ONEXPLAYER Mini Pro and GPD WIN MAX 2 handhelds. We can see that again, as we have seen so far, that the rest of the benchmark results are pretty much the same as each other. We could run the benchmarks again and have some minor differences between them. These scores are great, and there's no overall handheld with a far higher performance than the rest, but will that change for gaming performance? For the game benchmarks, we are testing at 3 TDPs, 11, 20 and 28 watts. The GPD screen resolution is 1920 by 1080, and this also means it runs at 720p. The other handhelds all run at 1200 and 800p, so there will be some difference in performance due to the slightly lower resolutions on the GPD WIN 4. We start with Forza Horizon 5, and we are running on the very low graphics settings. At 28 watts at 1080p, we get an average frames per second of 88. At 720p, we get 115. At 1080p at 20 watts, we get 79 frames per second, and at 11 watts, we get 46. Next, we are running Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark on the lowest graphics settings. At 28 watts 1080p, we get 72 frames per second average, and at 720p, we get 86. At 1080p 20 watts, we get 65 frames per second, and at 11 watts, we get 33. We run the Cyberpunk 2077 benchmarks on the low graphic settings. At 28 watts 1080p, we got an average frame rate of 53.55, and at 720p, we got a very good 74.97. At 1080p at 20 watts, we got 47.16, and at 11 watts, we got 22.06. We finished the benchmarks with the recently released Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, running on the minimal graphic settings. At 1080p 28 watts, we got an average frame rate of 71, and at 720p, we got triple digits with 101. At 1080p 20 watts, we got 64, and at 11 watts, we got 37. First, a quick summary of the game benchmark results across the different TDPs. The same pattern, with around 25 watts TDP being the sweet spot in terms of performance and power, applies to the GPD WIN 4. We can see a large increase in performance between 11 and 20 watts, and a comparatively lower increase between 20 and 28. And now to compare the results with the other 6800U handhelds. Please keep in mind that the resolution differences of 720p for the WIN 4 and 800p for the other handhelds. This will put the WIN 4 at a slight advantage in terms of performance, as it's displaying less on screen and will have a small increase in performance. The benchmark scores are overall roughly the same across the devices, which is good to see. As mentioned, you can rerun the benchmarks and get a few more or less FPS each time. Having roughly the same performance means we can decide which handheld PC to buy based on the design, features and price, for example. Running games at high resolution and graphic settings is good for numbers to compare, but not always actually to play. So we will be playing some games for the best settings at 60 or above FPS, as well as settings to play for conserving battery life. As the performance is mostly the same as the other handhelds, we will be using similar settings as those. For Overwatch 2, we can run at 1080p 28 watts TDP on the high graphics settings without using any upscaling. For best battery life, you can run at 720p at 11 watts with the low graphics settings. Forza Horizon 5 runs great on AMD processors. We can run at 1080p on a mix of medium and high graphics settings at 28 watts. For best battery life, you can run at 720p on the very low graphics settings at 11 watts and still keep within 60 FPS. On Doom Eternal, you have two choices: 1080p 28 watts on a mix of low and medium graphics settings, or 720p on the high graphics settings. For best battery life, you can run at 720p 15 watts on the low graphics settings. On Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, if you are playing the campaign, then you can go with 720p 28 watts on the balanced graphics settings, with no upscaling for around 60 FPS. If you are playing online, then you will probably want the highest FPS possible. So you can go with 720p 28 watts on the minimal graphics with no upscaling. We have seen with the other handhelds some great performance when it comes to emulation on them. Like the others, the GPD WIN 4 can emulate everything up to PlayStation 2 era without breaking a sweat. On many of those systems you can lower the TDP to save battery, or increase rendering resolutions for higher quality graphics. We will take a look at some of the newer or higher end systems that can be emulated. Xbox 360 emulation is really coming along nicely. For compatible games you could definitely get a solid frame rate. I tried some of my usual games including Sonic Racing Transformed, Project Gotham Racing 2 and Vanquish, and they were very playable. You will likely see some games with lag, but that is to be expected. For the Xbox emulators EMU, many of these newer emulators, they are work in progress, so compatibility can vary. For compatible games we see great performance, with many of the games we tried running at full or next to full speed. Depending on the game you can also increase the rendering resolution. Performance on the Citra emulator can be mixed. With some games such as Sonic Generations we see shader caching lags now and again, though the second time you play through it's pretty smooth. Less demanding games will overall run faster on the first playthrough though. For compatible games on RPCS3 you will find many of them running at full speed. I tried Wipeout HD, Tekken 6, Outrun Arcade and Skate 3, and they were all running at near or full speed, which is great to see. For Yuzu and Ryujinx we generally see very good performance across third and first party titles. Many of them are running at full or near full speed on average, but it does depend on the compatibility. Did you think I would forget to mention the console that inspired the GPD WIN 4 design? Despite the Vita emulator, Vita 3K, still being in development and compatibility can vary, there are still some working games that are pretty much perfect to play. If you want the smallest 6800U powered handheld, then the GPD WIN 4 wins that hands down. Whilst it's not quite trouser pocketable, you can fit it in a jacket pocket unlike the rest. We have seen from the comments that the Vita style design response is very much mixed, with people on both sides saying it's a great design or that GPD have cheaped out and copied it. Personally, I think it is great. You could say it's a Vita 2. The smaller screen size is something to consider. It's 6 inches in size compared to 7 inches on the AYANEO and ONEXPLAYER, and a massive 10 incher on the Max 2. I did find myself squinting to see some of the text on the WIN 4, whilst on the other displays I did not so much. If size matters, this is definitely a consideration. After spending some time with the GPD WIN 4, I found it comfortable to play on. It's not too small to have your hands feel cramped together, but compared to the larger handhelds you do have less space for your hands, and overall they do feel more comfortable on them. Performance wise, there is a slight overall advantage with the GPD WIN 4, as it runs at 1080p instead of the higher 1200p found on other handhelds. But you do lose some of the resolution if this is a factor for you. All of the games and emulators we tried run just the same as the other handhelds, so you don't lose or gain much in performance comparison. We will be making a full comparison video after the new year, so keep an eye out for that, and by then we should also have the ONEXPLAYER 2. We would also like to hear your thoughts on which handheld you would buy and why. Let us know in the comments. If the GPD WIN 4 is the one for you, then don't forget you can order yours at droix.co.uk or droix.net for worldwide shipping. And if you use the code GPD WIN 4 5OFF on the checkout, you get a 5% discount. Sorted. If you could also take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you have not already. We get many new viewers but not so many new subscribers. It helps to grow this channel and we can continue making these videos. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you back in our next video.